Recording in Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us on Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy Chidaushe. I am the program coordinator here at South Dakota Humanities Council. And today we're going to talk about something that kind of has been stuck in my mind for a little while, and I want to share it with all of you because there's always two sides to every story, right? That's what they say. So it's odd that, unfortunately, when it comes to the history of Thanksgiving, most Americans have been told only one side of the story. For generations, schools taught about Thanksgiving and Columbus Day from what I call Eurocentric perspective. That is to say, it emphasized the triumphs of colonists while downplaying how colonization actually led to the mass decimation of indigenous peoples and forever changed their way of life. So today we're going to talk about the real narrative of the Thanksgiving story, the whole story. And as we prepare to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States, we're going to discuss why it's vital to all of us in understanding the history of this country. And we're going to share some thoughts on ways to honor our Indigenous relatives in our everyday lives. So today's conversation will include the expertise of two individuals who I am both thankful and honored to have joining us, Dr. Rosie Sprague and chef and educator Luke Black Elk. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to let you guys go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do, and then we'll do a deep dive.
You want to go first, Luke, or you want me to go first?
I can go first if you don't mind. So I am a chef and educator. I work with NATIFS in Minneapolis, and NATIFS is the nonprofit branch of the Owamni restaurant. We actually own the restaurant. And if you don't know what Owamni is a all indigenous restaurant here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, started by Chef Sean Sherman. And we offer food that is sort of unique to the area because we don't have any food served that was here wasn't here prior to 1492. So we have no beef, no chicken, no pork, no wheat flour, no cane sugar, and no soy in our menu. So it's a very unique place to eat, and it's about highlighting indigenous food in a very practical way. But we'll get in. I know we're going to get into that later. So I work with them as an educator in the education department, where we do community education events, go around to schools and teach young people about indigenous food. I also run a farm here in Minnesota, and then do a little cooking on the side. So thank you.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Rosie Sprague. I am assistant professor of American Indian Studies here at Black Hills State University. I'm saying here at Black Hills State because I'm in my office right now. So disclaimer, if somebody knocks on my door, I might mute myself and be like, go away. But I'm originally from I guess a few places, Cannonball, North Dakota, on the Standing Rock Reservation. I've also lived in Fort Yates, North Dakota, and then half of my life I've lived in Rapid City, South Dakota. So back and forth between North Dakota and South Dakota. I have two children, one of whom is a freshman here at Black Hills State. Very happy about that. And my other, he's in middle school. And so what I do, obviously I teach American Indian Studies here on campus. I also work with our Native students who are here on campus. I'm an advisor for Lakota Miche, their student org. And so again, really advising them throughout the year with their events and things, and culminating in American Indian Awareness Week in April. And we also have our Wachipi, which is our biggest event in April.
Thank you. I'm so excited that you're both here, and we have a lot to talk about. So let's let's just talk about Thanksgiving, the history of the holiday itself. How did it come to be? Why was it even created in the first place? Let's get that out of the way.
I go. Why was it created in the first place? And I think that's a good question. I know it was created. It was a proclamation by President Lincoln at the time, and it was due to the end of the Civil War, and he really wanted to kind of lift the spirits of American people, and so he had this proclamation. And I have it in my notes here, what that proclamation was. It says, a proclamation for a day of thanksgiving, praise, and prayer. So that was in 1863 that this sort of, I'd say, event was named. But it definitely came from the idea that at one point in history, the Pilgrims sat down with the Native Americans and had a meal and shared a friendly meal in peace, right? That was the sort of myth or the lie that the actual Thanksgiving event was built on.
Well, and because we know from historical documents that really did happen in 1621, right? So we're talking 200 years later. Abe Lincoln said, "Oh, let's acknowledge this." But the first, and when I was looking into this, the first annual event after that 1621 meal was in 1636, I think, and it was by the Europeans just wanting to celebrate that they had just massacred a whole community of indigenous people. I think it was a day of celebration and thanksgiving for subduing the Pequots was
Yes,
their
it was.
proclamation. And
It was,
so from the very beginning, this has been about decimation.
Exactly. It was just that. And then again, not a lot of people understand or know that there were these massacres of people. And again, those unfortunately our relatives on the East Coast were touched first by this war, these warring and you know the celebration of a massacre of men, women, and children, right? And again, not something that I'm sure teachers don't want to say,
Yeah.
let's teach kindergarten this, but I think we need to find a way to introduce the idea that Thanksgiving isn't what it's cut out to be.
And then to your knowledge, Rosie, how much affected kind of the retelling of the story, especially at the end of the 19th century when the Indian Wars were coming to a close, and you know the government needed to have this unification story because up until that time it was these scary natives that were just savages and whatever, and you couldn't have a conversation, I guess, about a national founding myth and how everything was all well and good now when the newspapers were full of accounts about horrific violence between white Americans and Native peoples in the West. So how did that play into, how did that come to be, just kind of just got brushed away with this whole Thanksgiving story?
I think a lot of it has to do, again, brushing the history of what happened to Native people under the rug. Because we are a newly formed country at that time, and we want to be the best, right? We want to be bright and shiny and new, and it would be a stain on our grade book or grade report to have this history of genocidal acts against Native people. And so I think that had a lot to do with it as well, right? We wanted this country to be and look the best, and so we're going to kind of wipe it away, and then we're going to create this this holiday, this national holiday that uplifts us all as Americans, right? Because at the time too, we are seeing the mass assimilation of Native Americans, and we are beginning to see a boarding school era, right? And so the government is wanting to assimilate Native peoples, and so we would be just like everybody else. So again, it's all kind of this cloak that was put on to kind of again shy away from telling the real history, right? We just want to forget about what happened.
Well, and that kind of goes back to, I remember, I mean, I'm significantly older than either of you. So I remember, being in elementary school in 1621, and, we had the little pilgrim hats and the little headdresses. And we were taught that in 1621, there were some generic nameless Indians who welcomed the pilgrims to America, and they taught them how to live here. And then they sat down with these strong, courageous pilgrims and they came together as friends and gave thanks and celebrated. They were eating turkey, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, kind of like a friendly little brunch in the forest. And then after that incident, that little celebration, then basically natives just disappeared. Like there's nothing we're not taught about what happened up to that, after that point, or up to that point. So what are some of the myths? I mean, like, I think that one that jumps out at me is that pilgrims taught natives about giving thanks. Why is that like the most absurd thing? Like, to be historically accurate?
I don't, Luke, do you want to chime in too? I feel like I'm taking over the conversation.
No, you're doing amazing. But I mean, I can. I don't know why that's a part of the myth. This whole Thanksgiving was taught to Indigenous people, and I know Rosie and I's culture is all about Thanksgiving. And even like when we have celebrations, birthday celebrations or anniversaries and things like that, it's usually not about us receiving things. It's about what we can give to others. So it is kind of a very strange message, and then you mentioned food in that same little snippet there, and it's you know those foods you're talking about, the turkey, the sweet potatoes, the potatoes, the corn, all these things are all indigenous foods that also had to be sort of Americanized, right? In order to make them acceptable, in order to make them palatable for new Americans, right?
Yeah, because I was, when I was reading into some of the food, the traditional quote unquote foods that we're taught about, cranberries, nobody could even afford cranberries at the time, and sweet potatoes weren't even grown in North America yet at that time, right? And so it's just, there's just so many interesting things about the myth. I know that the History Channel, on their website, they talk about how the pilgrims invited the natives to the feast, but how is that inaccurate? Because the whole story, the lead up to how this meal in the forest happened, is really interesting. So can you give us a background on what the lead up was to that 1621 meal?
1521 feast, right?
Yeah, the feast,
and
yes.
yeah, the feast. And I know talking a little bit about that feast actually probably was more just like a autumn harvest. Natives and have always done, especially East Coast, actual harvesting. They would have a celebration and celebrate the things that they got. But that feast leading up to it was just Native people coming to the tribe, coming to and checking, like, what is going on here? These people are making really loud noises, right? And so they were interested in coming to see, finding out what was going on, but also um, it was about securing an alliance. That was what it was. It wasn't the pilgrims inviting the Native people to come and be peaceful and break bread. It was basically Native people going to the pilgrims and saying, we need an alliance. There's disease, there's decimation of our population. So it was really about securing that safety.
Well, and I think about, the true part of the narrative, the colonists the pilgrims were shooting guns and celebrating and whooping it up, and the Wampanoag chief was like, wait a second, what's going on over there? So he showed up at their encampment or whatever with like 90 warriors ready to like squash whatever's going on. What's going on here? And can you imagine? I mean, when I think about the narrative that the pilgrims invited the natives to this feast, they didn't have a choice. Like, what were they gonna, it wasn't this friendly little thing. It was like, okay, they're here. We need to probably stamp it down a little bit. Hey guys, come have some food with us. Because when you think about the whole turkey thing, the food that was served at that first meal, there wasn't a turkey there.
No.
Luke, do you know more about that? Because I know there was some venison.
I don't know much about the actual feast. I think there practically could have been some sort of foul there. Turkey, Turkey is very indigenous. In fact, that's something that indigenous people even slightly domesticated, and there's many multitudes of species of turkey, and a lot of that has to do with breeding programs, and there's all throughout North and South America, so and Central America.
So, and stepping back a little bit too, I want to address the whole kind of thought process that when the Mayflower arrived in America, it was the first contact type of thing, and that's not true either, right? Because indigenous people have been interacting with Europeans for over 100 years at that point. Can you tell us a little? Because some of them even spoke English. So, Rosie, what do you know about that background?
And I think the background, again, that was another a kind of myth, right? Is that our first contact was at this meal of Native, and like you said, Native Americans have been in contact with Europeans years before that. And if you really want to get into it, right? We often talk about Columbus, right? Finding America, and again, just kind of glossing over the idea that the Norsemen, right, were here way long before that, and interacting and trading with native peoples. So again, yeah, we've had contact with Europeans way before this, and so it's not. I think that again, that introduction to this kind of friendly first meeting, first contact, is really the myth that we begin our history of this country with.
Well, and I kind of want to expand a little bit on what you said a little while ago too, Rosie, in that the indigenous were trying to kind of forge an alliance because there was an issue with rivals, and it was for protection, right? Because ironically, a lot of the peoples, the Wampanoags, had been decimated by disease that were brought by the Europeans. So what was the purpose of the alliance that they wanted to form?
Purpose? I mean, usually when Native tribes align themselves, especially with other tribes or with the Europeans, it is for safety, it's for protection, right? A case in point, we have an example of this would be the Mandan Hidatsa Narikara of North Dakota, right? They call themselves three affiliated tribes, or MHA Nation. Their numbers were decimated too by warring and by disease, and so they came together as an alliance to have that safety. And so that's really what was the idea behind coming to the Pilgrims. Was their chief was, I gotta help my people. And so we have to figure this out, right? We have to figure out how to keep everybody safe. And our leaders have always had those really hard decisions to make, especially when you talk about reservation era, when our chiefs had to make the hard decision to succumb to living on reservations. So that's kind of what it was behind that idea.
So I'm thinking about too, as part of the history that the Pilgrims didn't exactly have a real. It seemed like to me that a respect for the indigenous people, the Wampanoags in particular. They were going into their cornfields, they were robbing their graves, they were taking whatever they needed, and then all of a sudden they were like, okay, well, I guess we could be friends with you. Was it friends? I mean, was that the whole? I mean, that's the story. The Thanksgiving story is that the Indians and the Pilgrims were friends. But how contentious was that whole lead up?
I don't really, I guess my history of it too. I'm not an expert in this, but again, it's on both sides. I think, like you said, that the respect really wasn't there for Native peoples from the Pilgrim side, just because always seen as savages, right? Seen as a lesser than, seen as we are probably going to take your land here sometime in the future anyway. So we really don't care if you are here or not. And I like how you brought that up about them going in and taking whatever they wanted, basically stealing food and things like that. Because again, another myth is the Native people came and helped them grow food and showed them how to do this, which they probably did, but a lot of that was thievery.
Yeah. I was surprised to learn about the grave robbing, and I mean, surprised in that I'd never heard about it before. Not necessarily surprised that it happened, but surprised that it was just something that we have never been exposed to. So after this friendly little brunch in the forest, what happened after that? The leader of the Wampanoags, what happened? Like, I'll let you tell the story because it's interesting, the aftermath.
Aftermath again is unfortunately more warring, right? More massacre. We see their leader killed, right? Because of their numbers, because the pilgrims just kind of overtook. You have disease, you have small numbers, and so we start to see a series of wars between native and non-native, and not just with the Pequot, right? But with the Wampanoags, and looking at talking about King Philip's War. And that was a big one that led into the death of King Philip or Metacom, and who unfortunately was quartered, right? And he had his head put on a spike and shown off for, I think it was like 25 years that it was placed for people to see. So again, it did not lead, this first meal did not lead to peace and friendship between natives and non-natives, right? It actually led to the decimation of many tribes, right? It led to these wars, which is really unfortunate. But again, it doesn't get told in schools, right? The history of that came after that.
I think we hear about, that there's a term, the Indian Wars, that era when there was the Indian Wars. And I've actually seen King Philip's War referred to as the first Indian War, because it was just the start of the ongoing betrayal of the indigenous people by the Europeans that came here. So, there was the disease. They were hunted for bounties. They were enslaved and shipped overseas, forced off their lands and onto reservations, and we're familiar then what happens with history. Then we start to get some of the truth, but it's the how that all came to be is pretty interesting. I wanted to touch on something too, like what you said, Luke. The giving thanks piece, that is nothing new to Native peoples. So what was the tradition of the Native peoples prior to settler colonization? What is the history or the tradition of giving thanks in Indigenous culture?
Well, it's so hard. I've noticed this throughout this whole thing, and I know my Hankashi is probably struggling with this too. Is all these questions are geared towards Indigenous people, like we're all one people, when in reality there are hundreds, like over 600 different nations just in North America, and that's not including all the nations down in South America and the surrounding islands. And so it varies from place to place, and really my expertise, if you want to call it that, is within my own culture. And so for us, like I said, it's really we get up every day, and it's a part of our culture to get up in the morning and give thanks for waking up. And now they sort of it seems spiritual, or maybe you want to call it religious, but it's not really that. A lot of people do it now. It's sort of affirming the day, and we sort of think about what we're going to do and plan out our daily life, and we do that as a family unit. And then we have songs of thanks, and we have actual ceremonies for Thanksgiving. So like when we have an event, we have something called a Wopila ceremony, which is, Wopila means kind of, it actually translates basically into English as Thanksgiving, or being thankful for receiving something. And it doesn't mean receiving something from another human being, but it can be taken that way. It means just the gifts that you get from the world around you. We're very much in tune with what we call Mother Earth, or we refer to the earth as our mother. And we know that, we talk about these harvest ceremonies, these Thanksgiving ceremonies. That's something that we just do as we go throughout our life. When you're harvesting, after you're done, you're going to have a big meal and get together with everyone who helped, and be thankful, and have community and dance. You see that in any culture across the world.
And I think that's what I wanted to touch on with the question, is that giving thanks is not something that's a one day a year event in any of the indigenous cultures. But the modern Thanksgiving celebration we talk about at the end of November every year only dates back to 1863 with Abraham Lincoln. In fact, pilgrims didn't get included in the tradition until after that. And then no one even referred to them as pilgrims until the 1870s. So this is a whole new modern construct of Thanksgiving. I mean, modern to say as in 1800s, not dating back to 1600s when this story actually is perceived to have taken place. So we're going to turn the corner a little bit and talk about why correcting the narrative now is so important. For me, the number one thing, I guess, was that the mythical version, what we've always thought about, or what we were taught, is that the story kind of relegates indigenous peoples solely to the past. Like I said, we hear about this, there's this great meal, and all of a sudden all the native people disappeared. And like, we don't talk about it anymore. But what else is there? What's the big picture? Why is it correcting the narrative so important?
I'll go first because I have an example of why it's so important to correct the narrative, and it has to do with again, understanding that Native people are still here, right? We're still very much here. We're not dinosaurs. We're not extinct. And it's important because you have children who previously been growing up with the idea that this feast came together, Native people were here, now they're gone. And an example of that is my daughter. And she knows that I tell this story, so that's okay. When my daughter Ella, she was in school, I believe it was second grade. And I tell this story, and I might get emotional, so I'm sorry. But she was in second grade, and it was around Thanksgiving time. And so I think one day she came home from school and she was very upset. And I was like, what's going on? What happened? And she's usually not upset. She's very sweet, very caring girl. But she was upset. She said that in school today, when she began by telling me that they're going to have a Thanksgiving meal in class. So I was like, oh, okay, and whatever. And then she began telling me that they had to pick whether they're going to be a pilgrim or an Indian. And so obviously I get very upset, but I want her to explain what's happening, why she's upset. So the teacher had them choose to be a pilgrim or Indian. And again, like you said, making the hats or making whatever feathered thing that they're going to wear. And so she said she was excited because she goes, I'm Dakota and Lakota. She goes, I want to be an Indian, right? And so she chose that. But the reason she was upset was because she was the only one that chose it. Nobody else wanted to be an Indian. Everybody wanted to be a pilgrim. So again, it's this idea that Native people are lesser than, right? And so she was very upset. She came home, she was crying. So it made me upset, right? So again, teaching our youth these kinds of things. And this was just not a few years ago, but this was, not so long ago that she had this happen to her, right? So it's still going on that teachers are teaching these things, right? But then how does my daughter, who is Native, right, that has a huge impact on other Native children, right, their identity, because then they don't want to be Native either, right? So that's kind of why this narrative is very much needed, especially in schools.
Thank you for that sharing that story, because I think, even for me, like I said, that happened to me when I was young, and we're talking like 40 something years ago. But this is not ancient history that this is going on. This is still, it's okay to do it, because, we're honoring the Native people. No, you're not. But I think that another piece to the story is that if we don't shed light on it, we're not linking the history of what happened then with the ongoing impacts of what settler colonialization did to the indigenous peoples. And so celebrating unity on Thanksgiving kind of ignores the history of what we've done as a country, right, to the indigenous people. What's your take on that? Because it was only what, 57 years ago that Native Americans received the right to vote in every state. This is not that long ago.
Yeah, it wasn't until 1978 that the Indigenous Religious Freedom Act. So we weren't allowed to practice our culture. And you know, a lot of foodways, a lot of food heritage is part of the culture. You know, culture and food go hand in hand. And so a lot of this erasure is really affecting us. You know, like Hankashi said, like Rosie said, our children are still being affected by this. You know, it might feel, you know, like to you, it's like, oh, this happened to me when I was a kid, but it's still happening to children. You know, we still have our kids talking to other young people, their peers, and they're connected through the world now because we're connected like you and I are right now via social media or the World Wide Web, and they're able to talk to people around the world, and they're still getting this thing where they're like, oh, well, we thought you guys were all gone. We've read about you in history books, but that's it. You know, we don't, you know, there's no relevancy, even though we are very relevant in ourselves to what's going on in the world, you know. And you know, especially with food, you know, if you think about the gifts of food that Indigenous people have given to the world, you know, if you look at Italian food culture, what do you think of? You think of tomatoes, and you wouldn't have tomatoes without Indigenous foodways. You look at Asian culture with the spicy chili peppers. Those are an American gift to the world. You think about any culture that has chocolate in it now, you know, the Dutch chocolate or whatever is out there. That is all from the Americas, you know, and corn. Corn is feeding the world right now, and that's one of the many gifts that Indigenous people have given to the whole entire world. And so when we're talking about Thanksgiving, you know, that's a part of it. If we're really going to be thankful about something, which a lot of Indigenous people we don't think of it as Thanksgiving anymore. We're really trying to change the name to Thanks-taking because we need to be thankful for what people took, and we need to acknowledge that. And that's a part of that is just acknowledging, you know, acknowledging what happened, because without acknowledging it, we're just ignoring it, and it's just continuing that erasure of us as humans.
Thank you, because that kind of leads into my thought of, you know, if we openly share the truth about the Thanksgiving myth, we allow for conversations like this, about conversations about healing and unity and what it means to be good human beings, instead of a story about the conquerors and the conquered. It's such a just really kind of a unfortunate story that it's just a myth that carries on, because when you said it's, you know, not Thanksgiving, more of Thanks-taking, Thanksgiving is also a national day of mourning. So I think a lot of society doesn't understand that, that to many Indigenous peoples, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning. So how do we correct the narrative? Like, do we just start with having the honest conversation?
I think we are starting the narrative. You know, that's a part of what we're doing here, and it's been happening for a while. You know, being able to speak about it. You know, there's been a lot of Indigenous movements that have highlighted the struggle of Indigenous people. You know, and it's you know, it's very hard to be an Indigenous person in these sorts of areas, because when you have to be an expert in so many things, you have to be an expert in language, culture, not just your own culture, but a multitude of Indigenous cultures. And so, you know, because you have questions, you know, coming at you about the Pequot, or, you know, we don't even talk about how, you know, we had contact with Polynesians on the West Coast far before we had contact with Europeans on the East Coast, you know. And so, you know, there's so much to learn, and there's so many things that so much good that can come out of it too, you know.
Yes. That's what I'm hoping for. So I think understanding the contrasting perspectives too is super important, because we can do that by reframing the telling or the teaching of the Thanksgiving story from the perspective of both sides. I mean, it's always just one side of the story that we get. But if we talk about what really happened, we'll be educating ourselves and our future generations about the destruction of cultures and historical trauma and genocide and atrocities, and even like you said, Luke, the differentiation between tribes. There's like you said, how many 700 odd different tribes and they're not all the same. And that's when I said, when I remember, like, they were just generic faceless Indians that just had, had a meal with these courageous pilgrims. And it's so much more than that. There is so much to learn. So, and in terms of these conversations, taking it a step further, how do changes in educational curriculum and educating society overall, how do we do that? How do we get the change into the school?
Well, and it starts with the movement to want to. It starts, and it really comes down to educators wanting. And you here in South Dakota, we have the Cheyenne Essential Understandings. They're not, the teachers don't have to. Right, some states have them mandated where the teachers have to implement Native history and culture into their curriculum. South Dakota doesn't, they don't have to, but they're encouraged, right? We're really encouraging of our teachers to implement the OSEUs. And is something technically gone wrong?
No, everything's fine.
Sorry. I'm
going to put the link to the OSEU standards in the chat because that was something I had on my list here.
Yeah, perfect. So they don't have to. They don't have to, but it's encouraged. What teachers in here in South Dakota do have to do is they have to take a South Dakota Indian education course for their certification. And again, that's just a step forward in teaching of Native history and culture. We do have a lot of teachers who are teaching Native history and culture, and I think the stigma with teaching history and culture in the schools is we have a lot of non-native teachers who feel like it's not their place to. I think they feel like I teach a course, one of the sections of Indian education, and I have a lot of teachers who say, I don't know if I'm the person to teach it. And we come back at them and say, no, you can. We encourage you, especially if you're non-native, right? Especially if you're in a school with no Native students. You should be teaching other non-Native children about the true history and culture. It's really important. So again, it starts with school. It starts with kindergarten through 12. Every grade should be learning, not just like one little booklet, right?
Yeah.
Of during Native American Heritage Month, we're going to learn about the natives. It should be through every subject.
Well, and I think when I was looking at the premise for when these standards began to take shape, and I think back in 2008 or something around there, the whole point was to learn about our Indigenous peoples, but also learn from them. And so if non-Indigenous people aren't willing to take that step in the classroom and say, I don't think, if they want to say, oh, it's not up to me, that I don't think I should speak about that, then who's going to? Because somebody has to. I know when I was in I was in Washington, D.C. earlier this year at the National Museum of the American Indian, and it was amazing. Little side note, if you get a chance to go, definitely go. But I spoke to someone there about, they have an initiative called the Native Knowledge 360 Initiative, where they have actually put together educational frameworks and essential understandings for other, just Indigenous culture overall, but it's different in educational materials, things like that. So it challenges common assumptions and it brings Native people out of the past. And so that could be done not just in the school, right? That could be community wide. That could be everybody. How do we do that?
I think I'm going to introduce a topic for Luke, but I think what Chef Luke and Chef Sean are doing talking about foods. I think foods is a really good pathway to teaching, especially children, right? You want to teach kindergartners about Thanksgiving or the events. Start by introducing them to the original foods, right? And kind of opening that, well, these are the tribes here in the United States, and these are their foods. And I know that's what they're doing, and it's awesome.
And that my friend Luke is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. Let's talk about food for a moment and a few notes about our food system. So before colonization, Native Americans grew and prepared food specific to their geographic regions. And food was also medicine. So can you tell us a little bit more about how even the food, like when we talk about how not all Native tribes are the same, not all Native peoples are the same can be said for the food systems to the, respective of geographic areas. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what we need to know?
I think there are, a lot of food regions, right? But they were still connected. There. So, like, say the Lakota people, we were processing, drying buffalo and every part of the utilizing every part of the buffalo for various things and trading that throughout the country. The Lakota people have words for abalone shell, for chocolate, for um, seaweed. One of the really old recipes that we have for uh, underground roasted bison is actually to wrap it with kelp to have the iodine and the salt absorb into the meat. We were trading for salt, because every human needs salt, right? We were trading for salt with the people in the Utah area around the Great Salt Lake who were harvesting salt out of that lake, and that was one of their main resources to trade with. And so, these weren't isolated places. Some of them were. You still look at places like our relatives in Alaska and in the Arctic. They are very isolated, and they do have very specific diets. But a lot of the more continental indigenous people, especially in the more temperate regions, we're trading vast amounts of food with each other. There's historical records of of what the U.S. Army went through and burnt, and they were burning tons and tons of food to continue the decimation of indigenous people, right? And they were burning swaths of land, and so when we talk about food and food regions, that's uh, what we're doing at Natives is really trying to highlight that and get these vibrant living cultures that are still out there practicing their ways. We talk about these Thanksgiving ceremonies. There are still very many tribes that do green corn dances, which is a point when you're harvesting corn before it's ripe, and you making it into a food, and so you're getting actually more out of your corn than just waiting until the end.
Yeah.
You're hungry for corn in the middle of the season, and so there's a way to utilize that. You also look at corn and how indigenous people found to nixtamalize corn, or how to wash the seed coat away and make it bioavailable. So if we talk about sweet corn is really not a nutrient food. It's actually sweet. Most sweet corn has as much sugar as a king size Snickers bar. And so when we're consuming sweet corn, we're not actually consuming a lot of nutrients. We're consuming a lot of sugar. And if we think about what happens with corn, I hate to be so graphic, but when we think about what happens with corn when we eat it off the cob, it just passes right through us. But when you take something like hominy or masa that has been treated with a wash of wood ash or lime slake and had the seed coat removed, that becomes completely bioavailable to your body, and so you know it's a much healthier way to live. And corn is something that started, 12,000 years ago in Central America as a very, very tiny little grain resembling wheat, and was through human nurturing was grown into a corn plant that has vastly different growth patterns from there's some in Peru that takes like 190 days to grow. It has a 2-foot ear with kernels that are like this big. And then there's a corn that grows in the near the boreal forest up north by the Haudenosaunee that only takes 50 days to mature. The plant only gets about 2 foot tall, and the ears are only about this big. And so it's just this amazing, and that's just one plant.
Yeah.
You go into tobacco, we could go into so many other things. We talk about, how indigenous people were doing something that just now becoming something in Western scientific society, ecoculture. We talk about permaculture, but now they're talking about ecoculture. But this is something that indigenous people have done for millennia. We were replanting wild rice and harvesting it on a yearly basis, and producing hundreds and hundreds of tons of wild rice out of lakes in the Great Lakes area. Rosie and I's people would gather timsla across the prairie and have enough to feed our families throughout the winter. That and bison meat. We were living in a culture where we had to we worked all through the summer and the warm season as hard as we wanted to, and we just sort of relaxed and let the winter pass by us as we ate bison meat and dry dehydrated vegetables. And sometimes it did get hard, but it got hard for people across the world. But the majority of the time we had a pretty good life. I don't know if that answers
Well,
the question.
no, that was excellent. And I was thinking about too, and especially corn, because corn is what everybody thinks of. Oh yeah, we got corn from the native peoples. But when you were talking earlier about, I'm Italian, so when you were talking about tomatoes, I'm like, yes. But it's so much more than corn in tomatoes, right? There's potatoes, pumpkins, strawberries. I was surprised. Maple sugar, raspberries, avocados. I know I'm leaving some out. It's a chili pepper, a chocolate. Thank you for bringing that up, because these are things that we don't think about. Even beans, and all kinds of varieties of beans. And so, how does that kind of come into current culture with like when you were talking about, how we could adjust our food systems now? How have we done that from what we already learned from the indigenous peoples, and how do we get back to that so we're actually growing quality food in a way that's sustainable to the earth?
I think we need to take a step back and really look at how indigenous culture worked. We weren't even the more static tribes, from what I've learned from reading history books and talking to people, is that they would move their settlements from time to time, and we were also not such a permanent culture. We didn't need buildings that could stand for 1,000 years, even though there are buildings that have stood for thousands of years. The majority of our homesteads were things that would absorb back into the earth after a few generations, and those people would move on to a new area, and we wouldn't completely decimate the area that we are in. That's something that we should understand as human beings across the world. Uh, even other animals. Human beings are just animals, right? Even other animals, when they start diminishing the resources in an area, they move to a new area, right? And so we can do that. We need to really work on our ways that we treat our foods, especially our grown vegetables, and not just that, but the people who are working in those fields. A part of if you think about being together as a whole community, and we can still do things like this, planting food together, even having these harvests, Thanksgiving things. We can really come together and have food that is produced in a way that is not just nutritious to our body, but good for our spirit because it'll be something that we're harvesting ourselves. It'll be with good intention. We'll be able to control what goes into that, the water, the pesticides, whatever it is, that is detrimental to our health and our body. We can make sure that those foods are better for us, and be eating the things that are good for us. If we talk about the food system now, you look at like a hothouse tomato and how much, being an Italian person, you probably know the difference between kind of a off red tomato from the store that's been grown in a hothouse versus something that you grew yourself and has that deep red, dense flavor. That's so much better for you and it tastes so much better.
There's a question in the chat from Mary. She wants to know, what did Native Americans do to preserve food for future use?
For that, it's just a lot of dehydrating, a lot of salting, a lot of smoking, fermentation, all of these things that, people do across the world. We weren't canning, but we did have jars, clay jars and things like that we were storing food in for long-term use. So a little bit of everything.
Okay, so we are running short on time, so I want to turn this conversation here to natives in particular, Luke, and what you all are doing there. Just for those not aware, I'll put a link in the chat to the website. NATIFS is actually an abbreviation for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And you also have an Indigenous food lab, which I think sounds amazing. I love the name of it. But it's a nonprofit, right? And it's founded by Sean Sherman, who's also, many of you may have heard of Sean Sherman, the sous chef. That's the Sean Sherman we're talking about. And that started up in 2017, right? Tell us a little bit about NATIFS and the Indigenous Food Lab and the work that you do there.
So NATIFS is a nonprofit that John Sherman started. He started it about the same time that he started the restaurant Owamini, which is, I said a little bit about that earlier. And so North American Traditional Indigenous Food System, which is a mouthful. Sean loves acronyms. He has them all the time, and he just likes putting those things together. And we were there at the beginning of NATIVS. We're like, no one's ever going to want to say natives. You're never going to make that work. And now we work with him in the program. And so what we do is just trying to highlight indigenous food throughout the country. We have a regional hub that we've started here in Minneapolis first, which is the first of its kind, is where the Indigenous Food Lab is, the IFL. And what we do at the IFL is we do numerous things. We're taking indigenous food and trying to make it palatable to modern palates, because not only were indigenous people colonized, but also our palates were colonized. And so all of us have gone from not eating bitter things to only wanting salty and sweet and umami flavors. We've left a sour and sweet kind of out of it. And so there's so much nutrients in bitter foods and other foods. And so we're trying to get people back into eating these things and finding a way to make them available to people. But also, we do a lot of work in education, and so that's where I do a lot of my work. And so we go around and go into classrooms, have adult education. We have classes. We create videos. I know you saw a lot of the videos, and if you go to the website, there are numerous videos that we've produced about how to make indigenous food. We also highlight a lot of wild food, and so there are also numerous free educational materials available. There are video resources, but we also will mail out, little pamphlets and different things like that for classroom activities. You can get a hold of us through the website, and we'll make ways to come out to places and visit people and run programs within schools. We work with children, we work with adults, we work with elders. We also have a program called MNI, MNI, which is the Lakota word for water, but that's meals for Native institutions, where we're trying to get Indigenous food into more schools and things like elderly nursing homes, anywhere where there's Indigenous people who might want food from their culture but not have access to it.
So I went and did a deep dive in the recipes on your and I put the link to the NATIFS website in the chat, because my family we've decided we're gonna replace our usual candied yams that we have at Thanksgiving. We're gonna give that maple and sage sweet potato recipe a try, and the sweet potato soup, and the Lakota winter bean soup, and the Three Sisters chili. And there's so many good recipes. But my question is, it's kind of a two-part thing. How difficult is it to learn how to identify or where to find foraged ingredients for the recipes on your website? And what do you do to find ingredients that aren't readily available for foraging, like sourdocks, which are in Alaska, right? Or fiddleheads or elderberries? What's that process look like for those of us who are rookies to this whole thing?
So there are some places that you can actually purchase a lot of those things, but as far as getting out and identifying things, there are a lot of very good books out there. As long as you're not getting anything that's written by AI, make sure that a human wrote it. And then there are, so many great people out there who are really teaching about forage plants, people across the country from many different backgrounds. A few of my really good friends that are also foragers are people like Sam Thayer, who has Samuel Thayer. He has a number of really great books. There's Alexis Nelson, who is a very famous TikTok creator. She goes by Black Forager. She's a wonderful resource to follow. And a lot of these people are on social media, and they, my wife, Linda Black Elk, they produce videos and educational materials constantly, and following them is a great way to learn a little bit. I learn a little bit from them every time I watch one of their videos or get to talk with them. And there are also a lot of foraging groups out there. And so, you look in your area, and there'll be people, whether it's, a mushroom group that people go out and get mushrooms, or maybe some people just like to go hike and gather berries, or, whatever. Um, there's lots of time, just make the time to go out and do it. My wife and I try to spend an hour a day and one day a week getting foraged material, and that just, it also helps with your health, getting out in nature and going for a walk. But one thing is there's not a lot, as long as you learn to avoid anything that looks like a carrot. The real deadly plants look like carrot plants.
That's good to know.
Other than that, know what poison ivy looks like. And all the other things, they taste so horrible that you're not going to put more than one of them in your mouth, and, taste a little bit. If it doesn't taste good, there are berries out there that some, they all look like a purple berry. They all look the same. You taste it. If it tastes sweet, then it's probably good. And if you don't know what it is, but if it tastes really bitter and acrid, that's probably not good to eat.
That's kind of Mother Nature's way of letting us know we shouldn't be eating it, right?
Right.
So my other question then related to that is for plants like purslane, stinging nettles, sumac, is it possible to grow plants like that in our own gardens or greenhouse spaces? And how do we get the seeds to do so?
Definitely able to grow those. A lot of them probably grow around you already. Like you were saying, some of the rare plants you could probably grow, or there are replacements. So when we talk about the sourdock from Alaska, there are, Rumex crispus, yellow duck that grows all across South Dakota. If you've ever seen the brown stalks in the wintertime, and they're just a field of brown uh, growing somewhere where there might have been a little bit of water, that's curly dock. And you can use the seeds, you can use the leaves, and you can take the seeds and you can grow them anywhere. You sprinkle those around. The term weed is not said just for fun. They will grow.
Well, we are really short on time. I wanted to point out couple things. There are the plant identification cards on your website, and I think they're great. It's like every nerd's dream is that website, because I found so much information that I am excited to learn about. And you have items for purchase on your website as well. Wild rice being one of them, and it's in my cart already. But what can we do to help amplify your efforts at NATIFS?
Just spread the word. Talk about it. Come visit us. Reach out if you're in education, reach out to us, because we would love to come visit you. And we are starting hubs across the country. So our next hub is actually going to be in Montana, and so we're moving that way. And then we're hoping for Juneau, Alaska, and a few other places. So we're going to be all over.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we are out of time, and I do want to thank you both so much for joining us, for opening our eyes and educating us, and helping us to be able to spread the true story of Thanksgiving. I hope that you guys can join us again. Everybody that's on this episode, we're gonna spread the conversation a little bit more even next week, when we have Jody Rave Spotted Bear will be here. She's the director of the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, and she's the online publisher of Buffalo's Fire. And then Levi Rickert will be here. He's the founder of Native News Online. And they're going to be here to talk about Indigenous news sovereignty, and why the role of these Indigenous news outlets is so important in preserving and promoting Indigenous culture, identity, and existence. So I hope you can join us again in a couple of weeks. But Luke, Rosie, thank you so very, very much. I encourage everyone to check out the NATIFS website, because there are some great recipes. And Sean Sherman's new cookbook just came out. You see, I've already got bookmarks there. I'm going to be making some blueberry leather this weekend. Really great stuff in there, and it's easy to make. So my granddaughter and I are going to make some blueberry leather. So with that, I do thank you all for joining us. Lunch hour's over, so I suppose we better get back to it. But join us again soon. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you.
Bye-bye.